prayer. Lord, help me to get out of your way and to let you speak. Let your words be a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. Let us hide your words in our hearts that we not sin against you, and that we may know you. In Jesus' name, amen. So we're doing 3 stations today. Station 6, which is Jesus being scourged and crowned with thorns. Station 7, which is Jesus carrying the cross. And station 5, which I guess I was looking at the wrong side to start out with. Jesus is judged by Pilate. So we're going to start with, was wondering, like, I thought I had been doing fine too. Yeah, so it's just on the back of the sheet, or we have to type your names at the front. So station 7 is maybe like the shortest out of all of these, because it's just like one single verse, especially when you cut across multiple different gospels. 5 is the largest out of these. And that's where I think where we're going to spend the bulk of our time is sort of looking at this, because it involves Pilate. And I got the passage from Matthew just written down right here. Is there anyone who would be willing to read this for us as we begin?
Oh, I can do that.
Go ahead.
Now, at the festival, the governor was accustomed to release a prisoner for the crowd, anyone whom they wanted. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Jesus Barabbas. So after they gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you? Jesus Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that they had handed him over. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with this innocent man, for today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him." Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus killed. The governor again said to them, "Which of the 2 do you want me to release for you?" They said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what should I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" All of them said, "Let him be crucified." Then he asked, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves."
So there's a lot to take in here right at the beginning of this station. So just try to picture what's happening here in your mind. So Pilate is being asked to basically process Jesus in an official capacity in some way, and basically give approval for execution. We have a crowd that is pushing for this. The crowd is being stirred up by the chief priests, and Pilate is sort of stuck here in the middle as we're dealing with this. So do you all get like a picture in your head when you read this passage?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Is there a key figure who is not clearly like indicated where they are? Yeah.
Yes.
Like what? So if you had to identify a protagonist for this scene, who is it? Like who's the main character here right now?
Pilate.
Yeah. And this is, I mean, Pilate has been a character who's always, I always go over the passages with him a little bit more attention and detail, just because he's a really fascinating figure to me. Because, I mean, I don't know if you all know, what do you know about Pilate outside of the passages in scripture? Have any of you read up on him or know anything about him or who he was? Oh, yeah. It's not
No,
fair. What
not, I mean, what, not,
So,
no, necessarily very familiar with Roman law.
right.
Yeah, and he had to be in good graces with,
Right.
you know, he had to try and, I think, he had to navigate very carefully, I think, between keeping a good relationship kind of with the powerful Hebrew people, but also with Rome.
Yes, and you would think that he would be doing that.
Yeah.
Historically, he didn't do that. He was a total jerk. He actually went out of his way to be quite a brutal ruler and was really well known for flubbing exactly that. So one of the things that really is interesting is, and when you listen to scholars talk about any passage involving Pilate, a lot of them say that when the way he acts here is very out of character for him on the basis of what we know about him historically. Because he apparently, because I mean, when you read the passage in Matthew, and then there are a couple other passages, and I have them listed down here. The passage in Mark, Luke, and John, and I give the chapters and verses, so if you all want to look at those at any point later, especially when you get into the Luke really makes Pilate seem kind of like he's trying very hard to rescue Jesus. John is like Pilate's having an existential crisis while talking with Jesus, and then he really tries to fight to save him. And this passage here, I mean, Mark is pretty like Pilate was here and he did this, and it's kind of like, here, there, and he's done, and he's just kind of in his job. It's super, super concise. This one also, I think, does an interesting job of sort of describing Pilate in a bit of a more realistic way, but a lot of the gospel writers were so very, very sympathetic to him. And I think that's super, super weird because this is the governmental authority who signed off on the death of Jesus Christ, right? So what?
Do you think it has to do with his wife warning
Right,
him?
and that's so yeah. Let's get into that a little bit. So I have a couple of set up in the questions. So let's start working through these questions before, because I could go off on Pilate for a long time. That's kind of why I gave him like a whole page here. So when you visualize this scene, where do you see it taking place in your head? Like if you had to describe it, like you describe the setting.
Like I feel like they would have been up on some kind of building or steps or something, and everybody would be out like in some kind of square or something, you know, kind of thing.
Must have been in the movie, because that's exactly what I think.
Yeah. I don't know, maybe. So,
Yeah.
I don't know, but that's what I picture, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the painting that he
The
directed us to
painting
look
thing,
at.
that's right, yeah.
Yeah, and the
you're right.
painting is up on a balcony and the people are down below.
Yeah, but that's what I've always kind of, yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
public, like
Yeah,
in a public
public, yeah.
place, right?
Mhm.
It seems like this would be a public place. And again, so and just to do it for a quick recap here, and I know we've touched on these, but who are the major actors in this scene? If we had to basically cast like a stage play of this, what roles do we need to fill?
Pilate,
Right.
The crowd.
the crowd, and then Barabbas and Jesus.
Barabbas, Jesus, maybe
Maybe,
Jesus.
yeah.
and
Yeah,
his
maybe.
wife.
And Pilate's wife would be
Yeah,
an important
that's right,
person to put
yeah.
in there as well. Are we missing anybody? So we've got Pilate, his wife, Barabbas, Jesus, maybe. I said the crowd already. I
People in
think.
the crowd, yeah.
And who else?
Chief priests, elders.
Yeah.
Right, the chief priests and the elders. Do we know anything about how Jesus is acting in this scene or where Jesus is? Does this, especially the Matthew passage, does it mention where he is at all?
No.
Why do you think that's the case? Why is Jesus sidelined here? Why is that important?
Well, he was held back for some reason.
Okay, so he's being held back. Any other thoughts? Not to say that that's not, I think it was a great thought, but
Maybe, and I have no idea, but maybe Matthew is trying to really identify the why of Jesus' death as far as the Jews were concerned. So he takes Jesus away from it.
right. And that, I mean, that, doesn't that say something about he's being held back which suggests that there's sort of a ceding or releasing of control here, right?
Yeah.
If we're decentralizing Jesus from the narrative, we, human beings, become the center of the narrative here when it comes to making this choice. And we have a mob, we have religious leaders, we have a government official, which if you kind of think about the different forms of government that we use, they're all represented here in some way, right? So in a lot of ways, this is very much power being concentrated in human hands. And we're getting to see how that power is managed, or what is being done with it.
One of the words that appear in a number of different gospels is he was handed over, which indicates things were done to him,
Right,
not him doing anything.
right, right.
Well, and Matthew being a Jew himself, was probably writing this in a way that he knew his Jewish community would understand. And to have Jesus, to make it clear that Jesus was being withheld, without just coming right out and saying it.
Right.
His constituents, his fellow Jews would understand what was going on there. It could be something that's even within Jewish tradition, that they don't appear in Pilate's court.
Right. Right, and I think that there's one, I can't remember which gospel it is, but they talked about not entering sort of the parts of the palace because they wanted to avoid ritual impurity, right? So there was still sort of a sense of them sort of trying to step off, but then working through the crowd in some way, through some form of manipulation. How, again, if we just look at Matthew, how do you think the author wants us to feel specifically about Pilate?
Kind of sorry for him. You know, he was in a tough choice. He didn't know what to do. You know, his wife's saying, "Don't do it," and then
Right.
and then the crowd's saying, "Do it," or and he didn't want to have a riot. So
Right.
it's just like, do I obey my wife? But if I do, this riot's gonna happen.
Right.
So it makes us feel kind of sorry for him.
Yeah. Do you, go ahead, Nancy.
He seems weak and. unwilling.
Interesting. Yeah, unpack that.
Yeah, well, the last sentence, "I am innocent of this man's blood, see to it yourself." Basically, he could say, "I have no idea what to do. You guys just do it."
Okay. So it's like kicking the can.
Yeah,
Basically, over just like, nah, this is above my pay grade. I don't want to deal with
Exactly.
this. So especially when the concern about the riot, why would that be important for Pilate? Like,
Well, he's trying to keep his supervisors happy
Yeah, he doesn't.
by minimizing
mhm.
and showing that he had control over the crowd.
Oh, so he wants to have you.
Yeah, if you
Once the
lose
appearance of-
control of
yeah.
all this and rioters are running through the city, I can just see, whoever's over him going, yeah, no.
Yeah.
So he had some concern then for maintaining his own position.
Yeah.
And like I was saying earlier, again, his reputation was he was already thought of as a pretty brutal ruler. And if there had been another riot pop up, he might have had to use more brutal tactics, and maybe he was trying to avoid that, especially if he was already in trouble with his supervisors, so to speak.
Well,
Right.
he's got his wife breathing down his.
Oh, yeah, no, that adds, and I really like that she sort of gets inserted in this mix here. And this feeds into some of the additional questions I have, like, when you're thinking about Pilate's motivation in this scene, with all of these pressures coming at him from different sides, when he ultimately makes that decision to wash his hands of the situation, it humanizes him a little bit, but does it make you still feel sorry for him when you think about it like that?
I don't feel the bit.
You have
sorry
like
for
no,
him.
you so Nancy is very much in the I'm not a Pilate fan camp.
I
No, I
And I
feel
have-
sorry for
You
him.
said- Yeah,
Because, yeah, I'm just saying because he can't make a decision either way. I mean, darn if he does, darn if he doesn't,
Yeah.
I don't know, I feel bad because when Jesus is gonna be, you know, died, then he's kind of responsible, so I don't know.
But it's also pretty political. I mean, like, as far as like, okay, I'm gonna let you execute this guy. I don't care, because you want to execute him. I'll release the guy you want me to release, but I am not gonna be held liable.
Right,
So he's making sure that he's not gonna be blamed.
right.
I think he sees that the crowd's gonna do that.
Yeah,
Whether he
anyway,
releases him or
yeah,
not,
yeah.
they're gonna make sure he dies.
Gotcha, yeah. Oh, then that's actually a pretty good point too. That might have been, that could have helped explain part of the reason he was sort of like, I really don't want to have anything to do with it.
Yeah.
So he's basically hitting eject.
But I kind of wonder, it's interesting to me that he had this kind of relationship with his wife, because that wasn't very common either.
Yeah, so, and let's talk about his wife's dream really, because I mean, we keep coming back to that. So what do y'all think about that?
Was it his wife that had the influence, or the fact that she had a dream?
Yeah.
Because dreams were very powerful, right? They were messages. So was it the fact she had a dream?
I mean, in that religious sense, they had like the oracles and like a lot of there were just a lot of like, like the gods communicating to you through dreams and visions. And so it may have just been the weight of there being a dream as a whole, not that it was necessarily coming from his wife. It could have come from his, you know, butler or whatever.
But the dream also, she says, have nothing to do with that innocent man. And that seems to stand out to me.
Me too.
Yeah.
She identifies him as innocent.
I wonder what happened to her in the
Yeah.
dream.
That's what I was just looking at.
Yeah, because I
Never
don't,
know.
the dream, as far as I know, it's only mentioned here in the Matthew account. Like, it doesn't really pop up in John, Luke, or Mark.
Yeah.
And we're never really told what her, I mean, I don't know if it was like Jesus appearing before her saying, you know, I am innocent, or if she got like a glimpse of God's glory, or Jesus like showed her the future. It's like, this is a cheeseburger or something like that. I mean, we have no idea what she dreamt about, right? But it was enough to scare her.
Well, it does kind of say a little bit about how much respect he had for the Sanhedrin.
Oh, unpack that a little bit. Go ahead.
Well, because found him guilty of blasphemy,
Okay.
and he found him guilty of nothing. So he couldn't give much credibility to the Sanhedrin when they brought him to him. I mean, what was his motivation?
Right.
To do anything?
Right. That's a good question. And again, historically speaking, he did not typically, from what I remember, he did not have good relationships with the Jewish community in the first place. So the lack of trust, or the, oh, what are they up to now vibe that we kind of get from him a little bit, especially some of these other passages. He's like, why are you here now?
And especially being one of their own.
Right. Which in Luke, he tries to just take it off his plate by sending him to Herod. He's like, this is not my problem. This is Herod's problem. Then Herod punts him back. And he's like, okay. Yeah, so it just has a, like, someone with a little more experience working in administration stuff more recently, I can sympathize with the desire to just take something off of my plate, especially when it looks like it's going to be a messy situation. So why did he literally wash his hands? Why do you think that was important? Like, and it's included in a couple of these different accounts.
Well, because he already saw the will of the crowd. But I have a feeling he also saw that they had been stirred up by the Sanhedrin. And so part of it, I think, was realizing that there was a group controlling the situation more than he was. And he just wanted to, bow out and go out the back door any way he could.
Right. And that's a good question.
Yeah, it's symbolic of washing the blood off, but,
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that's because the Jewish people did that.
That's
I mean, I think he was nodding to the Jewish rituals. And that was one of their
Oh, cool, yeah.
rituals, was like,
Yeah.
wash
I
your
hadn't thought of
hands,
that.
you know, because they were really very specific about washing your hands before you did stuff, before you touched stuff. And so I think maybe he was like, okay, guys, I'm washing my hands just like you guys do, you know, and,
Yeah,
so I'm thinking maybe it was a nod to them.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I had not thought of or picked up on that, though. That's pretty cool. All right, good.
I think it's one thing to say, I'm innocent of this man's blood. It's another to demonstrate it in some way. The demonstration of washing is, I think, significant,
Right.
Yeah.
and powerful.
Yeah.
I don't think it means anything, but
Right.
Yeah, and this is really silly, but they didn't have microphones, and so maybe if this crowd is huge, he needs to show them what he's doing. because
Oh,
his
yeah, that's a
voice-
good call
That's
too.
true.
His
Oh,
voice
right,
won't
yeah,
carry to the back of the crowd.
that's a good.
That is a really good insight. So one more, well, a couple of layers to this, but let's talk about the Barabbas thing here for just a second. So he has this custom of releasing a prisoner around the time of the Feast of the Crowd, right? So like someone gets a get out of jail free card during this particular time of year. Why do you think he pulls that card or plays that card right now in this context instead of doing it at a later or an earlier time?
Personally, he felt Jesus was innocent.
Okay. So-
And Barabbas was known, I mean.
Oh, no, we did, yeah, Barabbas is
They
guilty.
knew he had crimes, yeah, he committed things, so.
Right.
He was trying to get himself off the hook.
Mhm.
He
Okay,
assumed that the crowd was gonna say, well, we already know about Barabbas, we have a lot of questions about this other guy. So,
hmm.
it's also interesting, there's no external evidence of anyone releasing somebody during Passover
Mhm.
that they
Correct.
would, correct, you know?
Correct. So that's a really important point, I think, to make. So it kind of, did he do this just because he was trying to diffuse the riot? I'm throwing you a bone. Look, I'll release a prisoner. Go away.
Well, and I think that was kind of the ultimate goal.
Mhm.
And again, he was using a Jewish tradition to accomplish it. So he was obviously very familiar with Jewish,
Oh, yeah, yeah. And we do have good historical evidence for him being really familiar with it.
well, yeah.
He probably chose the worst prisoner he could choose.
Yeah, the worst
Oh,
offender.
right,
yeah.
That's also a really good point.
Because, you know, it's like, I'm gonna choose this guy because this guy's obviously the worst
Right.
one, so you're not gonna release him,
Right.
instead of just a thief or something, but
Mhm.
no, you know, he chose the one that was the
Right.
worst,
Yeah.
you know, thinking,
We can-
that's it.
Yeah, we can go have a really nice steak dinner, or we can go to Jack in the Box. Right. And they're like, Jack in the Box, and they're just going for the worst stuff. I want to be, for those of you who are watching this later online, yes, I am deliberately calling out Jack in the Box. So let me clear. My views do not reflect the views of First Presbyterian Church. This is 100% me. Just clear. So, yes, well, I want to be clear on that. Now, we've seen all this stuff, so it really seems like Pilate's caught in the middle. Do you feel like he's in, is it clear that he has any control here at all? Like, does he have any control over this situation?
He doesn't handle
I
it
feel
very
like
well.
the crowd has more control and the
Yeah.
religious leaders, yeah, I
So-
think, yeah.
The little bit he had, he didn't handle very well.
So here's another important question I think that we have to think about. Why on earth did they bring Jesus to Pilate in the first place?
I think they had to, because I think Jewish law, they couldn't
Yeah.
crucify somebody. It had to be declared by the Roman government or something.
Okay,
And I can't remember why, but I do remember reading that somewhere, that by Jewish law, they couldn't do that.
so now, but it seems like they're gonna kill him anyway,
Yeah.
right? So are they trying to make themselves look clean by quote unquote doing it the right way?
Mhm, mhm,
So in some ways, Pilate's kind of the scapegoat.
mhm.
How does the crowd respond in verse 25? And I did not include verse 25, sorry. Anybody have a Bible, crack one open, let's take a look at Matthew 27:25. And if you don't have one in front of you, I'll just go ahead and.
Yeah, well,
Let's read it.
Oh, you
Well,
had it?
Yeah, then the
Go ahead.
whole people as a whole answered, his blood be on us and on our children.
Yeah,
How do you feel about that response?
that's creepy. If I had a 2-year-old, I would not wish that on them or something, you know? Oh, they're gonna bear the stain of this guilt just because I feel like this.
Well, the crowd must have been mostly Jews too.
I know.
And to them, the Jewish court had already found him guilty of blasphemy. And so they felt that they were in the right.
Any finishing thoughts here before we move to station 6? Because I've got 2 more stations to stop at here before we're done today, and I'm monitoring our time. So any other thoughts? Yes, Stan.
With that last sentence that Matt just read, no wonder, I think Matthew and some of the other gospel writers can be looked at as being anti-Jewish, and used against them.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and that accusation is definitely, out of the 4 gospel writers, the one that often gets labeled as the most anti-Semitic is John, for sure. The language used in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's a little bit, I don't want to say wiggle room because that sounds wrong, but the terms used to describe Jewish opposition are not quite as harsh. In
Except
John,
that last verse.
well, yes, that last verse there.
That's huge.
But in John, the language is
Yeah.
it's more loaded language. The
Yeah.
terms that
Yeah,
he
that's
uses are nastier. I think it's the phrase that I've seen some theologians use to describe it. Like they actually just call the terminology he uses kind of nasty. So that's a fun conversation for another day.
But I find it interesting because that assumes that we immediately side with Jesus right away, right? And
Oh, yeah,
if
yeah,
we look at, I can't speak to world Christianity because that's something I don't have enough knowledge about. But if we just look at Christianity in our country and we look at where the church would be if they were in this scenario, and I think we have to think about how the church would identify potentially with the religious leaders, or at least a good chunk of the church. And so I think the lesson to learn is the one we missed by pointing fingers, that we need to examine ourselves and where we might be writing Jesus out of the story in sense of needing to go after some sort of, holy war of some sort or some type of religious fervor, coming out with being proud to say for generations after this, we are happy to have this blood on our hands because we're doing the right thing. And I think as a national church, we should take note of that.
Yeah, and so as we conclude this station, when we sort of hop back on the subway, I guess, and go to the next station, I don't know what metaphor I'm mixing in here, but when I've been thinking about this passage and reflecting on it, the absence of Jesus in this discussion is important. The fact that, at least for me, it's important, and the fact that we have these different forms of government intersecting with each other in a lot of ways here in this conversation, I think matters too. For me, this is a demonstration of the failure of human justice. To recognize that there is an innocent person who is being put up on charges that are not valid, right? And because of that, I think part of reckoning with the cross is reckoning with our failures to be a source of justice or to provide justice for people in the world. And for me, I really see just the abject failure that, but I do empathize with Pilate. I don't think that he did the right thing here at all. I mean, I think that we all can conclude, historically speaking, signing off on the death of Jesus, probably not going to look good on you, historically speaking. But given his circumstances, with all of these pressures pushing on him from all of these different sides, I do at least kind of feel bad for him. Does that make sense? You think that's a fair judgment, except for Nancy, who's like anti-Pilate?
I don't
Okay.
either.
And Stan's also in the, I hate Pilate club, okay?
Yeah, I just think in a general sense that they had much less regard for human life.
Yeah,
And
they
we impart that upon the characters.
Right.
You know.
And that's kind of why I think when the gospel writers were compiling it, gosh, like, because when you look at the record for what Pilate was actually like, that's the part, like, he's more human here than in the extra biblical sources that we have for him. Like, he seems like he's a much more kind fella here, but I mean, the man was a butcher.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I mean, he wasn't a good dude. And I think that when I kind of wonder when they were writing the gospels, if they sort of inserted some empathy for him in it, is that just kind of like, I don't know for sure. But anyway, that's just me.
Well, I think I mean, Rome certainly was an issue for them, but there was a lot of strife between the
Yeah.
Christians, Jews, in which they
Right.
were, had come from and stuff. So it's not surprising to see that there's some shade cast on, on the Jews in the.
Yeah. Well, and also as you get later into like the 2nd century, 3rd century, there was increasing sympathy for the Roman Empire and for kind of connecting Rome with the church a little bit as well. So I kind of wonder if some of that crept into some of the thinking here, and that's why they were maybe trying to humanize Pilate as the Roman figure. That also gets really interesting when we take a look at the next station. So let's move to station 6. Who would like to read this little blurb here for us?
I can. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on his head. They put a reed in his right hand and knelt before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. After mocking him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him.
Does anybody notice something important missing from the Matthew account that's in the name of the Station of the Cross?
They don't mention him being flogged,
There you go.
because I was gonna say, the whole idea of them taking off the robe, putting the robe on when he was bleeding, and then taking it off, it's like reopened the wounds, is what I've always heard, that it made it worse. Because it's like, okay, we'll pat this down, now the bleeding's kind of stopped. Oh, we'll take the robe off,
Yeah.
starting again, it's like.
Yes.
You know.
Fun fact, when you take a look, and again, I'm monitoring our time here a little bit. If you look at the account in Mark, Luke, and John, scourging only occurs in one of them. And it's in the account in John. And it's mentioned just in passing. If you look at this.
Pilate had him flogged, right? It
He
says, one of the
did-
accounts says Pilate had him flogged.
That's John.
Okay.
Yeah. And if you look, actually, let me just jump ahead for you all here really quick. I can just call these up really fast. With the Mark account, if you look at Mark, hang on, 16 through 20, the soldiers led him into the courtyard of the palace. They called together the whole cohort. They clothed him in a purple cloak, and after twisting some thorns in the crown, they put it on his head. They began saluting it. Yeah, it's purple here. And that's important. I'm going to get into, so it's a red robe here, right? Purple here in this account. They began saluting him, "Hail, King of the Jews." They struck his head with the reed, spat upon him, knelt down in homage to him. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him and led him out to be crucified. And there's even one of the accounts here mentions Pilate saying, "Would you like me to have him flogged, or shall I release him to you and crucify or kill Barabbas instead?" Right? So there is one of the accounts that actually sort of suggests that Pilate had not had him flogged or scourged. And then in John, it clearly says that he was scourged. And that's the only one that does this. If we could jump over to the Luke account very briefly here. This is Luke 23. Let's see if the color of the robe changes again.
Yeah, that was weird.
Because the color matters. And I'll get to why here in just a second. 22. The third time he said to them, "Why, what evil has he done?" Oh no, hang on. Release Barabbas. The third time they said to him, "Why, what evil has he done? I found him no ground for the sentence of death." Okay, listen to this. "I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified. Their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over as they wished. As they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, to carry the cross. So we completely skip over this entire thing. So what's the color of the robe in Luke? There's no robe, nothing.
Yeah.
And he has this line about, well, I'll flog him and then release him. So that implies that if flogging had taken place, we go directly to the crucifixion procession. Now, let's check out the passage in John really fast.
He was flogged in Mark, right? Did you get, is that what you said?
He was not flogged in Mark. Let me see. Mark. Oh, he did flog him in that. Hang on, let me jump over.
Mark 15:15.
So it sounds like he was flogged in Mark.
The first before where you started reading.
Oh, it was. Okay, so that was my mistake. So he did get flogged in Mark and in John. Let me go ahead and say that one out loud here. So it's 15. Yeah, Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. So then, okay, so he did get flogged there. So that is two sources that support that. But then if we look at John, let's jump over to that one really fast. Oh my gosh, where are you? John 19.
Flawed is a weird word.
It's a weird word, and it's a very unpleasant process.
Yeah.
John 19, 1-3. Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged, so that lines up with Mark.
Yeah.
The soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they dressed him in a purple robe. So the
Okay.
color again is different.
Okay.
They kept coming up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and striking him on the face. And then Pilate brings him back out, and it's after the beating and the flogging, and he's in the robe with the crown. That's when they do the, "Do you want me to release him or not?" And he appears before the crowd here in this passage with that get up sort of all around him. So there's some meaningful differences here in between these accounts. So anything stick out to you about those differences? This is me just gonna pause and give you all a
So
chance.
did they all mention the crown of thorns or?
No,
not all.
Luke does
Luke's
not
different.
have any mocking, no robe, no.
No, nothing. Yeah, so the other three do. So Matthew, Mark, and John do. Luke just decides to just jump over that and just go straight to executing as quickly
So
as
what's
possible.
the significance of the crown?
Let's talk about that. How many of you have ever heard of a Roman triumph parade? Fun historical fact. This is pulled from the Wikipedia entry for it. The Roman triumph, or triumphus, was a civil ceremony and religious rite of ancient Rome. It was held to publicly celebrate and sanctify the success of a military commander who had led Roman forces to victory in the service of the state, or in some historical traditions, one who had successfully completed a foreign war. On the day of his triumph, the general wore a crown of laurel and an all-purple, gold-embroidered triumphal toga or robe. This was regalia that identified him as near divine or as near kingly. In some accounts, his face was painted red, perhaps an imitation of Jupiter, Rome's highest god. The general rode in a four-horse chariot through the streets of Rome in unarmed procession, with his army, his captives, and the spoils of his war following before him. So when you look, let's, now that I've said that, let's look at this passage from Matthew again and just listen to the elements of what the soldiers, because they would have all known what this was. This was an honor, like at a certain point during the Roman Empire, that you'd had to apply to the Roman Senate to receive. And when a Caesar did this, at the end of the triumphal procession, the crowd would shout "Triumphe" at the Caesar, basically, and demand that the Caesar manifest his godhood in reality at the very end of it. So listen to the mechanics of this. The soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters. They gathered the whole cohort. That would have been all the other soldiers were gathered around Jesus.
How many are in a cohort?
That's a good question.
See, in my mind, it's hundreds of soldiers.
Yeah, it's.
Let me Google. Can you Google real quick and I can continue to read? So we'll come back. Let's put a pin in that. It's probably quite a few. Like they got it. 480.
400, Okay,
Well, Wikipedia,
Okay,
yeah.
yeah,
it's
Wikipedia.
gotta be true.
So they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And we already know that in other accounts that could be purple. So, but whether it's scarlet, it was a fancy robe, right?
Yeah.
After twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on his head. So that's two elements of the triumph right there. They put a reed in his right hand, which would have been a sign of authority. They kneel before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." This would have been "Hail Caesar," right? They spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. So they're perverting the triumphal procession ceremony. After mocking him, they stripped him of the robe, which that's important because they're ripping all of those honors away from him, put his own clothes back on him to put him back in his place and led him away to crucify him. And I've seen some folks argue that when you think about the way the accounts are written, they would have, like the gospel writers would have known what a triumph was. And when you look at the elements of the stations of the cross, they kind of parallel some of the events that would have happened in a Roman triumph. So it's a kind of an archaic little fact. Like the first time I heard about this was from my pastor back in high school in Tulsa, who was a history major, who studied a lot of Roman history. And he noticed this and like actually did a little writing on it and thought it was a really cool thing. But when you dig into the mechanics of it, it makes a lot of sense because what's interesting about this particular triumphal procession is Jesus is sort of triumphing or parading through the streets with the cross. At the end of it, he's supposed to manifest his godhood. And he does.
Yeah.
Right? Like he actually completes the ceremony correctly at the end. So Roman readers of the Gospels would have recognized immediately what is happening here when they looked at this. And they would have recognized that even though the soldiers were mocking him by using this, the fact that he continues on he parades through the streets, he gets to the end where there's supposed to be a sacrifice made, and he himself is the sacrifice at the end, and he does manifest his godhood. For a Roman reader of any of the Gospels, this would have been a sign of godhood. Does that make sense? Even though it was mocking at first. Yeah.
And even one of the Roman soldiers.
Exactly. At the end, it's important that it was a soldier who goes, he really was the Son of God.
Right.
And he was probably a member of this cohort who had seen all of this. So that's kind of the joke coming back on them at the end,
Right.
going, "Oh, oops, we just killed a god."
Yeah.
Whoops. But that led that soldier to what looked like, or some gospel writers interpret that as a moment of faith, right?
And to me, trying to imagine the fear of realizing that.
Oh my gosh,
and
yes.
wondering what's coming down out of the skies now.
But then when you look at what happens in Matthew, what happens after Jesus is crucified in Matthew?
Is that the earthquake one and the sky gets dark?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Matthew gets super apocalyptic with that stuff. It's like it's not just the earthquake and the curtain being torn. The dead come out of their graves, right? Like the dead are raised when Jesus died. So we have zombies running around the streets, not actual zombies, but you get what I'm going for, right? So like it's a very apocalyptic vibe, which I think that's important because, again, I think that fits in with the narrative of the Roman triumph. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. So when we're thinking about this, so why is it important that it was a crown of thorns in particular that was put on his head? Like there's so much symbolism kind of baked into that. What do you all think about when you think about the crown of thorns?
I think of pain.
I think of little pricks of pain, like it's all over, but it's little, so it's not like one massive blow. It's like these constant pricking. I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
And they're looking at him as some psycho. And so they're attacking his brain in a sense.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Because of their impression of
Right. Any other thoughts about it?
Speaking of it medically, the face has got lots and lots of blood vessels. And so anytime you cut your face, it'll bleed a lot. And so, medically, and then they hit him with the reed, making it harder, pounding
Right.
it kind of like. So, I mean, I'm thinking that he must have just really been streaming blood.
Right.
Because anytime, somebody has a facial act, you think, that they're really horrible, then you clean it off and it's just a little cut, but
Right,
but it
right.
bleeds terribly. So I imagine it was very much a sight to see his face and his head bleeding tremendous.
So, and now that we've established that the scourging actually has two gospels supporting it, how is Jesus doing right now?
Not great physically.
No,
He's anemic,
yeah, he's been bleeding a lot. His face is probably,
probably breathing
Probably.
hard just to
yeah.
stay conscious.
Does he look good?
No.
Well, even before being flogged, even before being arrested, he had, I can't remember which gospel it's described in, he had the stress of going through prayer
Right.
that caused his vessels to burst through his skin,
Right.
a hematidrosis. And so you read about that condition and they tell you that it's very much like a third-degree sunburn.
Yeah.
And so
That's interesting, yeah.
even being arrested, being handled for an arrest would have been enough to bring tears to most anybody else.
Right.
And so, he's already hypersensitized,
Right.
and then they're just playing off of that.
Yeah, they are. So, fun what if or hypothetical scenario. So at this point, with all of these injuries being in place, let's say for whatever reason, the plan of God had been different. And God decided that Jesus didn't need to be crucified. If Pilate's heart had been moved to release Jesus at this moment with these injuries, would Jesus have survived those injuries? Medically speaking. What do you think?
Well, it's possible.
Possible.
It's possible. I mean, they weren't, they could have gone either way. I mean, he was,
Mhm.
very dehydrated. He was asking for water when he was on the cross.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's possible that he could have, of course,
Mhm.
knowing that he's God, of course he could have healed himself, but I mean, it's possible that he could have still survived it, but it's also possible that he could have died. From it,
Yeah. Like just the infections alone.
Well, there's that,
Yeah.
In the far back of my mind, flogging was being whipped 49 times.
Mhm.
That's a lot of whipping.
And there were like
Especially-
knots in the.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Knots of bone, glass, so they are clawing skin and at a certain point, muscle off of your back. So, I mean, I don't know much about the mortality rate for the procedure of flogging, but I would be willing to bet it was pretty high.
And I don't know if it was 49, but that's way back there somewhere.
Yeah. So he's in not good shape. So Jesus is not doing well. And I'm really glad that Pam brought up the vasculature in the face in particular. His face would have been coated in blood, which was an important part of the Roman triumph reception as well, painting the victor's face red.
Oh,
Yeah.
Right. So, okay. Are there any parting thoughts for Station 6? Again, I'm watching our time here because I know Matt has a second show coming up pretty soon. So, are there any parting thoughts before we transition to Station 7? You doing okay?
I was just gonna say, when face was red, it was the victor, so.
Right. Yes. No, and I do believe that is a significant feature of that. I think that again would have been something that they might have understood when they were reading that passage. All right, this one is literally a single verse. And if you look at a couple other gospels, like Luke just completely skips over Jesus carrying his own cross and jumps right to Simon of Cyrene, who incidentally, I think Simon is the next station coming up in Station 8. So let's just pay attention to this here very briefly. After mocking him, they stripped him of the robe, they put his own clothes on him, Then they led him away to crucify him. And this station is, Jesus carries the cross. So he had the cross for a bit. So
John doesn't have Simon and Simon.
I know.
At all.
there's no Simon or Simon in John. So Jesus carried the entire length of the procession.
Weird.
Yeah, it is. Because I mean, Simon's in all
And
the others.
they even mention his son Rufus and Alexander and all that, and you know, like
In
his
the others,
sons
yeah.
and all that. It's
Mhm.
interesting.
Yeah.
That whole family is just left out.
Yeah, it's just kind of blip that into existence. So anyway, I kind of talked about this first question here a little bit, sort of the stripping of the robe off of Jesus here, and what that kind of relates to some thoughts of Station 6. Why is it important that Jesus carried the cross himself?
Symbolizing our sin.
He carried the cross. Yeah.
Mhm.
It's also the way crucifixions were done. I mean, that's just,
Mhm.
that was protocol.
Mhm.
Prisoners
Actually-
carried their own crossbar.
Mhm.
Yeah, I was wondering about that because we don't hear about other people. I mean, is that how it was done then?
Yeah.
Because they didn't just show up and then
No,
and place on it. They always had to.
and there's a whole humiliation process, what I was reading.
Yeah.
Okay,
Included all the
so
things
that
we
happened
talked
to others
about
too. It
today,
wasn't
and
unique to
carrying
Jesus.
your
So
own
the
instrument of
pole
death.
part was there, and then they usually just carried the
The
cross.
bar, yeah, the bar, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, but the humiliation component of things is important. Because so think about it like this. Let's say you're convicted of a crime. I don't know what it was, what you did, but the state decides to execute you. And as you're making your way to the execution chamber, they put the instrument that you're going to be killed by into your hands, and they force you to carry it into the execution room. How would you feel about that? Holding the thing that's going to kill you.
This is a lot more public than an execution room, though. This is through the street.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Don.
This is through the street that he's carrying this in very public
Right.
humiliation. And he's saying nothing. He's just taking it.
Right. And then Sarah?
But there's also an element of like, you deserve this, you've brought yourself to this place,
Hmm.
you have brought this upon yourself. We are just playing out what, you know, justice wise should happen according to them, right? So are they absolving themselves of some degree of?
Well, if everybody had to do it, I think it also shows that Jesus was human. He was like all humans. I mean,
He didn't get special
he
treatment.
didn't get special,
No special treatment.
unless somebody else carries it.
Which that's a fun question for next week. It's sort of, because, yeah, it's a good thought to kind of carry into the discussion for next week.
Well, and some of the things that they had them do was to have an effect on the crowd more than, or just as much as on the individual.
Mhm.
So it was a deterrent to doing criminal acts.
Right, which is part of, that's why it was so public, was just scare people.
Right.
Right. And that's really what the whole point of crucifixion was. It's such a visual, visceral, nasty, public thing. Because Rome was really good at crowd control. They were butchers that knew how to scare people.
Oh, yeah.
It was a
And
means of social control.
Yes,
Just generally.
precisely.
right.
It's a lynching.
It is a lynching.
It's more than discouraging people from breaking the law, it's a power tool.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
And for crimes as little as thievery, I mean, just
Oh, yeah.
because,
No, it was,
yeah,
Yeah.
it didn't take much to put you there.
no. So what has Jesus said in any of the last stations, the ones that we visited today? What has Jesus had to say to us?
I am, that's about the only thing he said.
Right, or not even that, that was even before,
Well,
Yeah, I
before,
don't think he
yeah.
said anything.
In what we've read, yeah.
not in these particular verses, he's been quiet. In John, he's a bit chattier. He talks with Pilate and he disturbs Pilate pretty significantly in John, but with these accounts here in Matthew, he's quiet.
Mhm.
He doesn't have much to say.
Well, wasn't John one of the real close disciples, or is this a different John?
There's some argument about who wrote the gospel, and it's also considered to be one of the later written gospels, so there's some head scratching about the degree to which we trust John in
Yeah.
terms of it, because his narrative is so different.
Well,
But-
it's also told from a perspective of Jesus as God, and so you would make Jesus the actor in the story
Correct.
because he is a cosmic being, and that's what
Correct.
we're framing him as, whereas these accounts didn't have.
These were
that.
earlier, like Matthew, Mark, and Luke, maybe Luke, maybe not. These seem like they're earlier. John shows a more evolved theology that's been around for a while
Right.
about Jesus's godhood. Now, why is it important that Jesus was quiet?
Because he's focused on his Father.
I feel like he's letting play out what needs to happen.
Yeah.
And what more is there for him to say? He's
Mhm.
said and done it.
He's been railroaded and he knows it.
Yeah. Stan, I can hear the ears grinding from here.
Yeah, it's also a fulfillment of the Old Testament, where he opened not his mouth.
Right.
Yeah.
Would you have been able to keep your mouth shut if they were executing you?
No.
No. You'd just be talking all the way to the point that they put the needle in.
No, but I mean, here's the thing though, if I had been flogged as severely as he had, it would take all your energy just to move, so you may not
Right.
be able to talk.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a
So,
good
I
point.
mean, I probably would not be talking in that,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Before that, you were.
Before that, I would have been
Right.
talking, yeah. I want an attorney. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I want a good lawyer.
Well,
Which, yeah,
being silent, I think, also fit with the prophet's
yeah,
statement of being the lamb.
quiet before the shears, or silent before the shears,
Right.
the silence of the lambs.
I can see where this related, we watched a biopic on Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and how they came up at the same time with different backgrounds and stuff this week. It was really interesting, but they showed a lot of the, like the lunch counters and the, bus boycotts and things like that. And just this stalwart, I'm going to just be and be silent and let the violence happen to me. And that's how I'm gonna speak. And you can, they looked and said, part of it was, there was some Gandhi stuff too, they bring that up, but but there's an element of like, that's what Jesus modeled, and so they said, we're gonna do what Jesus did, that's how we make, decide to play out their faith, so it was really striking.
Well, it then shines the light on the injustice.
Right.
That's,
Right.
yeah, you see it play out.
Right,
Don't want to be a distraction to that.
correct. Because they can't accuse you of anything at that point. You really get to see their ugliness on full display.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I think that gives you plenty of time to get down and get ready for the next service, right? So perfect. So we can go ahead and conclude there. So next week, I don't know who's teaching.
It's Don Chisholm.
Don, I think you're teaching.
Next, and he's got the next 3 stations.
Gotcha. So that'd be 8, 9,
And
and
10.
10.
Mhm.
Gotcha. So we are,
So is that the last one then?
No,
No,
there's 2 more after that. And each ones are gonna be 2.
11 and
the next
12.
2, yeah.
Who teaches those?
No, Todd is teaching the
11,
last 2.
Wayne's
Seven,
doing,
12, and then Todd's got 13, 14.
Okay, that's
So we, yeah, cause yeah, I don't remember either. It's fine,
right.
which
You
is
just
probably
wanted to
not
make
good.
sure it wasn't
because-
you, right?
Yeah, no, that's sort of, right, kind of like my surprise, that like, oh yeah, I'm teaching, when I found out last
Yeah,
week, as a
yeah.
reminder, okay. So let's just wrap up here with a quick word of prayer. Lord, thank you for the opportunity to come together and talk about what you went through. Help us to pay attention and regard what you have suffered through, and also help us to pay attention to the fact that you were silent in the midst of that suffering. I pray that what you had gone through and the pain that you endured in your silence will help bring us peace. Thank you for what you've done. In Jesus' name, amen.